time being, it's impossible for me to take my family back to the UK safely. Well, for a start, the only time that I've come back to the UK is...
Harry had already watched patronages disappear, uniforms become complicated symbols, and his place inside royal life shrink year after year. But this was different. This was the last military thread, still connecting him emotionally to the institution he once served beside. When Charles authorized the final severance, the message was brutally simple. One chapter was not being suspended, reviewed, or reconsidered. It was being closed forever. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Harry stared at the final paragraph longer than anyone expected. Military service had never been just another royal responsibility to him. It had given him structure, purpose, and an identity shaped by service rather than birth. That was why this decision carried more weight than the loss of an ordinary patronage. A ceremonial military royal honor is a symbolic association, linking a member of the royal family with a military body on behalf of the crown. Charles had now signed a permanent palace order, ending his son's final remaining connection of that kind, cutting the last formal military bridge between Harry and the working royal structure. Harry read the wording again, then once more. A documented palace account prepared for this dramatized narrative records that he lowered the page, pressed his thumb against its edge, and asked only one question. Had his father personally approved the final language? The answer came without hesitation. Yes. That single word changed his expression. Anger might have been easier. Instead, silence took over, because the decision reached directly into the part of his life he believed could survive every other royal rupture. Charles felt the same weight from the opposite side. He remained alone after signing, the pen still resting beside the folder, and did not immediately call anyone back into the room. The king understood that his signature was not erasing military service already completed. It was ending ceremonial representation connected to present royal duty. Yet that distinction offered little emotional protection. He knew his son would not read the order as a technical adjustment. Harry would read it as final separation. Then came the detail that made the decision even harder to absorb. A senior palace official, speaking in a private recorded briefing created for this dramatized account, confirmed that the wording had been deliberately made permanent. There was no temporary suspension clause, no automatic review, no quiet mechanism allowing restoration later. The order had also been prepared days earlier and held back, while Charles decided whether to soften its final terms. Harry realized what that meant. His father had been given time to leave one narrow door open, and chose to close it. The loss itself was now clear. The real mystery was why Charles believed that final door had become too dangerous to leave unlocked. And to understand that, the story has to return to the two men on opposite sides of the order, and everything the military once represented between them. For Harry, military life had offered something royal life rarely could: a role with clear rules, earned respect, and an identity that did not depend entirely on birth. For Charles, however, the crown demanded something very different: continuity, discipline, and boundaries that could survive family conflict. That difference had been manageable when father and son still spoke through private pain. Now it had become the fault line beneath everything. Harry carried those years differently from almost every other royal memory. Service had given him comrades who judged him by effort, discipline, and courage rather than position in a family tree. He had known hierarchy, but it was a hierarchy built around duty. That mattered, because a ceremonial military appointment is not the same as active service. It is an honorary royal connection, through which a working member of the family represents the crown alongside the armed forces. Harry understood the distinction. Emotionally, however, the two worlds had become tied together. Harry remembered the moments when that identity had steadied him, when royal life felt uncertain, Military belonging had given him something solid. When headlines reduced him to family conflict, service reminded him that he had once occupied a role he believed he had earned for himself. That was why the new order cut deeper than an ordinary title loss. It did not erase what he had done, but to him, it felt like the institution was refusing to recognize the man those years had helped create. Charles felt that danger too. After dinner, he spoke privately with Camilla while a closed folder remained between them. He turned it over once, then stopped. "Some things cannot remain half inside and half outside forever," he said, in a recorded private conversation, created for this dramatized account. The Queen Consort did not interrupt. She watched him struggle with the sentence, because the king was not talking only about protocol. He was talking about his son. Charles then admitted what made the decision unbearable. Being a father pulled him toward memory, loyalty, and mercy. Being sovereign pulled him toward consistency. A sovereign is the reigning monarch, the person who carries the institution's constitutional and ceremonial authority. And he knew military appointments could not simply become permanent family possessions. Camilla heard the pause before he added that the hardest choices were the ones where those two duties pointed in opposite directions. William had already been warned that a final military decision was coming. The prince, however, had not initially seen the exact wording. He knew restrictions were being considered, but permanence was another matter. When he later understood that there would be no automatic review, his concern shifted from policy to consequence. He knew Harry would see finality where advisors saw clarity. Harry eventually learned the same distinction everyone around Charles kept repeating. His actual military record remained untouched. Yet that truth brought almost no comfort. Service lives in memory, but ceremony is how institutions publicly acknowledge memory. Once that last symbolic link disappeared, he felt the separation in a way legal wording could never soften. The question therefore changed. This was no longer about why Harry cared so deeply. Everyone now understood that. The real question was what had happened to convince Charles that symbolic ambiguity had become too dangerous to preserve. That tension had existed for years, yet it did not become irreversible until one particular military ceremony forced the palace to confront a contradiction it could no longer ignore. Long before the final order reached Harry, one ceremony had quietly changed the conversation inside the palace. It was supposed to be routine, measured, formal, tightly controlled. Instead, a disagreement over military representation became the moment Charles stopped seeing the issue as temporary. Those present would later remember not a shouting match, but something more dangerous inside royal walls. A calm conversation in which neither side moved an inch. Palace officials had spent months trying to protect a narrow line. Harry's years of service could still be respected without giving him an active ceremonial role inside the working royal structure. That distinction mattered because ceremonial military representation means appearing on behalf of the crown in an honorary military capacity, rather than simply being recognized for service already completed. Charles understood how deeply that difference affected his son, which was why he had resisted demands for an immediate permanent break. The king preferred limits that preserved dignity, without pretending nothing had changed. Harry pushed directly against that compromise. During preparations for a Windsor military remembrance ceremony created for this dramatized account, he requested permission to take part with ceremonial military recognition normally reserved for working royal representation. To him, the request felt simple. He had served. He still cared deeply about veterans, and he believed that history should stand apart from the family conflict surrounding him. Charles saw something else. He saw a public symbol carrying institutional meaning, and he refused. Harry confronted his father privately after the decision. He pushed his chair back and stood before the conversation had fully ended. "The military was the one part of my life that was never supposed to become part of this," He said in a recorded conversation created for this dramatized narrative. The hurt behind the words was unmistakable. Charles did not raise his voice. He told him that nobody was taking away what he had earned, but the crown still had to decide what he represented now. William caught part of the aftermath. The prince saw his brother leave with anger written into every movement, then looked back toward the room where their father remained. Charles had not followed Harry. He stood with both hands resting against the back of a chair, silent and visibly shaken. The future king understood immediately that something had changed. This was no longer a disagreement about one ceremony. It had become a test of whether an exception could survive without creating another argument at every major military event. Charles received the warning shortly afterward. A private palace briefing prepared after the confrontation stated that repeated uncertainty would continue producing disputes over uniforms, appearances, honors, and ceremonial participation. One sentence carried more weight than the rest. A permanent distinction may eventually be necessary. The king read it twice, then marked the line. Harry knew nothing about that sentence at the time. Months later, however, those words would become the logic behind the permanent order placed in front of him. The Windsor confrontation created the logic for a permanent break. The next confrontation would decide whether father and son could stop it before that logic became law inside the palace. When Harry finally challenged Charles directly, the argument was not really about uniforms, appointments, or ceremonial language. It was about something far older. Could a father recognize what mattered most to his son, even when the institution demanded distance? And could that son accept that the man sitting opposite him no longer possessed the freedom to act only as his father? Inside one private room, those questions finally collided. Harry asked for the meeting himself. He had learned that a permanent severance was now under serious consideration, and this time he wanted no advisors, no private secretaries, no palace officials translating emotion into careful language. Charles agreed. That mattered because the decision involved ceremonial royal honors, formal military associations held on behalf of the crown rather than personal military awards earned through active service. The king understood the distinction perfectly. He also understood that his son would not experience the loss in such neat terms. Harry spoke first, and did not soften the point. In a recorded private conversation, created for this dramatized account, he told his father that removing the last military connection felt like taking everything that had happened after his royal departure and using it to judge everything that had come before. His service, he argued, belonged to a different chapter. It had existed before the interviews, before the family rupture, before commercial deals and public accusations. Charles listened without interruption, but his expression tightened because he knew exactly where the argument was going. Charles finally answered with equal firmness. Harry's military service, he said, remained his forever. No order could rewrite it. But ceremonial royal representation belonged to current duty, not memory. The monarch had to decide who could publicly carry the crown's military associations in the present. Harry shook his head. To him, that distinction sounded clean on paper and brutal in practice. The role had been symbolic, yes, but symbols were exactly what remained when active service had ended. Harry then asked the question Charles had feared. Would this still be happening if their personal relationship were better? Charles did not answer immediately. The silence stretched long enough to become its own confession. Harry watched his father carefully, and the hesitation hurt more than a direct reply. When the king finally spoke, he admitted that trust had become part of the decision. Not trust in Harry's courage or his military past. That was not in question. The problem was whether a royal military symbol could remain safely separate from public family disputes, commercial identity, and the constant uncertainty surrounding his place inside the monarchy. Harry rose before the conversation was finished. He took several steps toward the door, stopped, and turned back. Charles remained seated. "Are you making this decision as my father?" Harry asked, "or as the king?" Charles looked at him for several seconds before answering through the documented account. "I no longer have the luxury of separating them when the crown is involved." That sentence ended the argument without resolving the pain. Yet even Charles's personal conviction was only part of the equation, because behind the father stood an institution determined to eliminate ambiguity, and its reasoning was colder than Harry expected. Royal decisions can look intensely personal from the outside, especially when a father signs away his son's last ceremonial connection. But the monarchy rarely operates through emotion alone. Behind Charles's signature sat advisors, military protocol, precedent, public expectation, and one uncomfortable principle: ceremonial honors only work when everyone understands exactly whom the wearer represents. Harry's unresolved position had turned that simple principle into a constitutional headache. William understood the problem the moment the recommendation reached him. Harry's actual military service could not be erased, because earned service belongs to the individual who completed it. An honorary royal military appointment is different. It is a ceremonial role, held on behalf of the crown, usually tied to active representation of the monarchy. That difference had become critical. Every major anniversary, uniform question, remembrance event, and ceremonial appearance risked reopening the same argument about where Harry stood. William read the briefing slowly. He accepted much of its logic, but the final wording made him uneasy. The prince knew his brother would not interpret permanent severance as simple administrative tidying. Harry would hear something harsher: rejection, finality, a message that the institution no longer wanted even a symbolic military connection with him. That knowledge stayed with the future king as he reached the section containing the possible outcomes. Charles had already challenged the advisors before William arrived. The king asked whether one narrow exception could survive, perhaps a single symbolic military link that recognized his son's service without restoring a wider royal role. A documented palace briefing created for this dramatized account records the answer as blunt. Any exception, officials warned, would reopen the same uncertainty whenever another ceremony arose. One exception would invite another request. One unresolved symbol could keep the entire dispute alive. 3 choices remained on the table. Charles could preserve the existing arrangement. He could suspend the final link indefinitely, or he could sever it permanently. The monarch studied all 3 because the last option carried the greatest emotional cost. Yet it also offered what the others did not: certainty. William entered the study after the recommendation had been narrowed down. He saw the 3 marked sections on the desk and immediately understood that his father had reached the point of decision. Charles rested one finger beside the final option. "If we choose clarity," he said in a recorded conversation prepared for this dramatized narrative, "then it must actually be clear." William did not argue immediately. Later, however, he asked why permanence was necessary. Why not leave some possibility for restoration if relationships improved? Charles answered with a sentence that revealed the deeper fear behind the order. Leaving the door technically open, he said, would encourage everyone, including Harry, to keep waiting beside it. That was the true machinery behind the decision. The crown wanted the argument to end, not merely become quieter. Harry would soon discover what that meant, beyond folders and private meetings. The decision was now permanent on paper. Its emotional cost would become real only when he faced the first ceremony where the absence of that final military connection could be felt. The first consequence did not arrive through another confrontation. It arrived through absence. A military remembrance event approached. Invitations were arranged, uniforms prepared, ceremonial roles assigned, and Harry's old connection was simply no longer there. No argument could restore it. No private interpretation could soften it. For the first time, The new order stopped being language inside a palace document and became something he had to experience in real time. Harry knew he could still honor veterans privately, speak about his years of service, and stand beside former comrades without asking permission from the crown. What had disappeared was different. A ceremonial royal military link is an honorary connection that allows a working member of the royal family to represent the monarchy within military tradition and public ceremony. That role was now gone. The distinction mattered because Harry's actual service remained untouched. Yet the public symbol that once connected that service to royal duty had been removed. Harry followed the remembrance coverage quietly as the ceremony unfolded. Names of military associations were mentioned alongside the royals now representing them, and each reference seemed to underline what was missing. He had expected frustration. He had prepared himself for anger. But as the event continued, something heavier replaced both. Meghan watched him stop scrolling, then place his phone face down before the coverage had finished. She asked whether he wanted it turned back on. "Not today," Harry said. Meghan did not press him. She had seen him angry before, but this was not anger. In a private recorded conversation created for this dramatized account, Harry later admitted that he had expected the decision to make him furious. He had not expected it to feel like grief. The Duchess understood why. Military life had been tied to belonging, purpose, and memories of a version of himself that existed before the deepest family fractures. Losing the ceremonial connection forced him to accept that the crown now considered that chapter institutionally finished. Harry's phone moved again later that day. A message from a former service colleague carried none of the palace language that had surrounded the dispute. The words were simple. An order could change an appointment, but it could not erase the years already served. Harry read the message more than once. For the first time since receiving Charles's decision, the separation between service and royal symbolism began to feel less like an insult and more like a painful fact he might eventually survive. Charles received unexpected news of his own. A senior aide informed the king that his son had declined suggestions for an angry public response. The monarch had prepared himself for another cycle of statements, accusations, and defensive palace briefings. Instead, there was silence. That restraint unsettled him more than confrontation might have. Harry had chosen not to fight publicly, but his silence was not surrender. It created an opening. For once, Harry did not answer loss with public defiance. He asked instead for something far smaller and far more personal than the honor Charles had taken away. The turning point came because neither man tried to reverse history. Harry did not ask for the honor back. Charles did not offer to reopen the order. With advisors removed and the argument stripped of ceremony, father and son finally spoke about what had actually been lost. Not a uniform, not an appointment. Recognition. Harry wanted to know whether his father still respected the soldier he had once been. Harry made the request carefully. He asked for one final private conversation and made clear before it began that he was not seeking restoration of the ceremonial link. That distinction changed everything. A ceremonial military honor is a symbolic royal appointment connected to representing the crown, not proof of active service already completed. Charles understood that his son was no longer challenging the institution. He was asking whether the institution's decision had changed how his father saw him. Harry spoke without anger. In a recorded private conversation, created for this dramatized account, he told Charles that military service had been one of the few parts of his identity he believed could survive every royal dispute. Family relationships had fractured. Public roles had disappeared. Trust had been damaged. But those years of service had felt untouchable, because they belonged to a time when duty had been simple. The order had made him fear that even those memories were now being judged through everything that came later. Charles listened, then admitted something he had avoided saying before. He should have explained the distinction personally before signing the final decision. The king told him that nothing in the order diminished the service itself. The appointment could end because royal representation had changed, but the years Harry had served could not be reassigned, cancelled, or rewritten. For once, the monarch did not hide behind advisors or carefully prepared language. He accepted that the clarity he wanted had come with pain he could have handled better. Harry then asked the question that mattered most. Did his father regret making the severance permanent? Charles paused, but this time the silence did not feel evasive. He reached across the table and rested his hand against the closed folder between them. "That paper can end an appointment," he said through the documented account. "It cannot rewrite your service." Harry looked down but stayed where he was. Charles answered the question directly. He regretted the pain. He did not regret the clarity. Harry finally understood the boundary his father had been trying to draw. Military service was something he had earned as a man. Royal military honors were roles he had held because the institution once required him to represent it. The two were emotionally connected, but they were not the same thing. Nothing between them was magically repaired. Too much history remained. But the argument had changed. Their private understanding would remain unseen. Outside those walls, however, the decision was about to become a national argument over duty, family, punishment, and what military honor truly means. Once the permanent severance became public, the story escaped the language of palace protocol almost instantly. Some saw a sovereign enforcing overdue boundaries. Others saw a father closing one door too many. Veterans debated the distinction between service and ceremonial honor. Royal commentators argued over symbolism. And across Britain, one image came to define the moment: Charles in military dress, while Harry's royal military connection existed only in memory. Broadcasters moved quickly to explain the difference at the heart of the dispute. Harry's actual years of military service remained part of his personal record and could not be erased by royal decision. What had ended was his final ceremonial connection to the working monarchy. A ceremonial military honor is an honorary role through which a royal formally represents the crown within military tradition. That distinction mattered because one side saw clarity, while the other saw a painful refusal to preserve even a single symbolic exception. William watched the reaction with growing discomfort. Every discussion about protocol seemed to become another judgment about his brother and their father. A fictional morning newspaper captured the mood with brutal simplicity. Its front page carried an old photograph of Harry in military uniform beneath the headline, "The Last Link Cut." Outside Buckingham Palace, television crews repeated the words as a small crowd argued over whether Charles had shown discipline or gone too far. The prince saw the paper over breakfast, folded it once, and said quietly that the headline made a family wound look like a military victory. Charles faced pressure of his own. Advisors suggested that the palace issue a stronger statement explaining why the decision had become unavoidable, including references to Harry's public disputes and separation from working royal duty. The king refused. In a documented palace conversation created for this dramatized account, he insisted that the order should stand on institutional reasoning alone. He would not turn the final military break into another attack on his son. The monarch had wanted clarity, not humiliation. Harry then delivered the response almost nobody expected. Instead of accusing his father of cruelty or challenging the order publicly, he released a restrained acknowledgement through a prepared statement. He emphasized pride in his military service, gratitude toward those with whom he had served, and respect for the bonds that remained beyond royal titles. The tone surprised supporters who expected defiance, and critics who expected another confrontation. William noticed the shift immediately. Harry had lost the ceremonial argument, but he had refused to let the public battle define his military identity. Charles noticed it too. For the first time, Silence was not being used as punishment. It was being used as restraint. The palace had won clarity. Harry had lost his final ceremonial link, and the public had chosen sides. Yet the true verdict lay somewhere deeper than either victory or defeat. In the end, Charles succeeded in doing exactly what the order was designed to do. He ended ambiguity. Harry's final ceremonial military link to the working monarchy was gone, permanently and unmistakably. But the decision also exposed a boundary even royal authority could not cross. A sovereign could remove an appointment. A palace could redefine representation. Neither could erase years of service, personal memory, or the complicated bond between a father and son. Harry no longer expected the order to change. He understood that the ceremonial honor was not returning, and Charles had no intention of reopening the decision. A ceremonial military appointment is a symbolic royal role carried on behalf of the crown, while actual military service belongs to the person who completed it. That distinction had once felt cold and technical. Now it became the line that allowed Harry to separate what he had earned from what the monarchy had once allowed him to represent. Charles accepted the cost of that clarity without celebrating it. The king knew the permanent break had wounded his son, but he also believed that leaving symbolic exceptions open indefinitely would have created the same arguments again and again. Every uniform question, remembrance ceremony, and military anniversary would have reopened the uncertainty. For the monarch, permanence was painful, yet he believed endless ambiguity would have been worse. William understood both sides more clearly than anyone expected. In a private recorded conversation created for this dramatized account, the prince acknowledged the painful truth connecting his father and brother. Charles had protected the institution by ending the role. Harry had protected something equally personal by refusing to let that decision redefine his military past. Neither man had truly won. Each had simply chosen what he could still preserve. Harry faced his father one final time over the issue without demanding another reversal. He told Charles plainly that he still disagreed with the decision. The king did not ask him to pretend otherwise. Instead, he answered that disagreement did not erase respect. The words did not repair years of damage, and neither man offered an apology large enough to cover everything between them. But this time, Harry did not leave in anger. Charles did not retreat behind palace language. They accepted the boundary for what it was. Charles later closed the final military file and put it away without ceremony. Harry, elsewhere, kept the memories of his service untouched. That contrast contained the entire meaning of what had happened. The crown could decide who represented it. It could remove honorary roles, close ceremonial doors, and define the duties of a working royal. But it could not claim ownership over the years a man had already lived. That became the final verdict. Harry the working royal had been separated forever from Harry the veteran. Charles had ended the crown's ceremonial connection to that part of his son's life, but he had not erased the service itself. Charles could close the palace door, remove the ceremonial honor, and sever the final royal military link forever. What he could not take away was the soldier Harry had already been, and that distinction became the one piece of dignity both father and son were finally able to leave intact. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.